The phone call came at 2 in the morning on a freezing February night in 1984, ripping through the silence of a London hotel room where Lemmy Kilmister sat alone, nursing his fifth Jack Daniels and Coke of the evening. The voice on the other end belonged to someone he had never met, but whose reputation preceded him like a freight train. Van Halen's tour manager, calling with an offer that would make any musician's heart race, a once-in-a-lifetime collaboration on the European leg of the Jump Tour, the biggest rock spectacle of the decade, with Motorhead opening and a joint finale that would bring together the world's greatest guitar god and the most uncompromising bass player in heavy metal history. The manager's voice dripped with excitement as he painted the picture. Sold-out stadiums, millions of dollars, magazine covers, the music history in the making. But Lemmy's response, delivered in that unmistakable gravelly growl, was so blunt and so final that it sent shockwaves through the industry within hours. "Tell Eddie I said no." What happened next would remain one of rock and roll's most puzzling mysteries for decades. A rejection so unexpected and so incomprehensible that even Eddie Van Halen himself, upon hearing the news in a Los Angeles recording studio just 4 hours later, allegedly punched a hole in the drywall and refused to speak to anyone for the rest of the day. The world wanted to know why Lemmy Kilmister, a man who lived for the stage and never backed down from anything, would turn down the biggest offer of his career. But the real reason, buried beneath layers of pride, principle, and a handshake made in a smoke-filled bar 3 years earlier, she would not surface until decades later. And when it did, it revealed something far more profound about the soul of rock and roll than anyone could have imagined. To understand why Lemmy said no to Van Halen, you have to go back to 1981, to a night at the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Strip, where the neon lights burned hot and the whiskey flowed like religion. Lemmy was holding court at his usual corner booth, the one he claimed every single night when Motorhead was in town, surrounded by cigarette smoke thick enough to choke a horse, and the kind of characters who only emerge after midnight in Los Angeles. Eddie Van Halen walked in sometime around 1 in the morning, fresh off a recording session for what would become Fair Warning. His face flushed with the kind of creative euphoria that comes from nailing a guitar solo that rewrites the rule book. The two men had met before, casually, at industry parties and backstage encounters. But this night was different. Eddie slid into the booth across from Lemmy without asking, ordered a vodka straight up, and for the next 3 hours they talked about everything. About music, about the industry, about the compromises that success demands, and the lines you draw in the sand when record executives start calling the shots. Lemmy did most of the talking, the way he always did, his voice cutting through the bar noise like a chainsaw through butter. And Eddie listened with the intensity of a student who had just found a teacher worth learning from. At some point, deep into the night when the bar was starting to empty, and the bartender was giving them the look that said, "Last call was 20 minutes ago," the conversation turned to artistic integrity, to the difference between making music for the love of it and making music to feed the machine that chews up artists and spits out products. Eddie confessed something that night, something he had never told anyone outside his inner circle, that the pressure from Warner Brothers to make Van Halen more commercial, more radio-friendly, more palatable to the masses was crushing him, that he felt like he was losing control of the very thing he had built with his own hands. Lemmy leaned back, took a long pull from his Jack and Coke. Ayrton said something that Eddie would carry with him for the rest of his life. The moment you start playing for them instead of for yourself, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. They shook hands that night, a grip that lasted longer than it needed to, a wordless pact between two men who understood that rock and roll was not a business transaction, but a way of life, a refusal to compromise even when the money was good and the lights were bright. Eddie left the Rainbow sometime around 4 in the morning, walking out into the purple dawn of a Los Angeles sunrise, and Lemmy stayed behind, ordering another drink, watching the door swing shut behind the guitar virtuoso who had just poured his soul out to a man he barely knew. That handshake, that conversation, at that unspoken agreement, it became the foundation for everything that followed, the invisible thread that would connect their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. But what Lemmy didn't know that night, what Eddie kept hidden behind his smile and his vodka and his easy California charm, was that Van Halen was about to make a seismic shift, a transformation so complete and so calculated that it would redefine the band forever and set them on a collision course with everything Lemmy stood for. By 1983, Van Halen was no longer just a hard rock band. They were becoming something else entirely. The synthesizer had crept into their DNA, reshaping their sound from raw guitar-driven power into something slicker, shinier, more digestible for MTV audiences. Jump, the single that would catapult them into mainstream success, Eve was built on a synthesizer riff so catchy it dominated radio for months. But to Lemmy, listening to it for the first time in early 1984 while driving through the English countryside, it felt like a betrayal. Not of him personally, but of the principles they had discussed that night at the Rainbow. The promise to never let the machine win. Lemmy turned the radio off halfway through the song and kept driving in silence. He understood the temptation. Van Halen was selling millions of records now, packing arenas that Motorhead could only dream of headlining, appearing on magazine covers and television shows, and becoming the kind of crossover sensation that transcends music and enters the realm of pure cultural phenomenon. The money was staggering, the fame intoxicating, the validation from the mainstream music industry complete. But understanding it didn't mean he had to respect it, and it certainly didn't mean he had to participate in it. When the phone call came weeks later, offering Motorhead the opening slot on the Jump Tour with a collaborative finale where Lemmy and Eddie would share the stage, Lemmy's mind went back to that night at the Rainbow. He thought about Eddie's confession, about the fear in his eyes, about the handshake that sealed a promise between two artists who refused to compromise. And here was Eddie, just 2 years later, riding high on a synthesizer-driven pop hit, asking him to legitimize the very thing they had sworn to fight against. The tour manager kept talking, listing the benefits, the exposure, the money. So much money that Motorhead could pay off their debts and finance the next 3 albums. But Lemmy wasn't listening. He was thinking about what it would mean to stand on that stage, to play after a set filled with Jump and other songs that prioritized chart positions over guitar solos, to be part of a spectacle that represented everything he had rejected. The answer came instantly, because there was only one answer a man like Lemmy could give. The music industry in 1984 was a tightly connected web of managers, promoters, agents, and journalists who all talked to each other constantly, trading gossip and rumors like currency. And when word got out that Lemmy Kilmister had turned down Van Halen, not just any tour, but the Jump Tour, the biggest rock event of the year, the phones started ringing off the hook. Record executives called Motorhead's manager, demanding to know if Lemmy had lost his mind. To journalists scrambled to get quotes from anyone who might have insight into the decision. And rival bands whispered in disbelief that someone would actually say no to that kind of opportunity. But Lemmy didn't issue a public statement, didn't call a press conference, didn't explain himself to anyone who asked. He just kept doing what he always did, playing grimy clubs across Europe with Motorhead, drinking Jack Daniels until the sun came up, and refusing to apologize for being exactly who he was. Eddie Van Halen, meanwhile, was reportedly devastated by the rejection, not because it hurt the tour financially. They found a replacement opener within days, but because it felt personal. like a judgment on the choices he had made, a public rebuke from someone whose opinion actually mattered to him. And his bandmates tried to convince him that Lemmy was just being difficult, that he was stubborn and set in his ways, and too proud to accept help from a band that had eclipsed Motorhead in commercial success. But Eddie knew better. He knew that Lemmy's rejection wasn't about pride or jealousy or any of the petty motivations that usually drive musicians to make decisions against their own interests. It was about principle, about the line in the sand they had drawn together that night at the Rainbow, and Eddie had crossed it. The Jump Tour went on without Motorhead, playing to sold-out stadiums across Europe and North America, with Eddie performing his synthesizer solos to crowds who screamed their approval and bought the records by the millions. But there was something hollow about it, something missing that Eddie couldn't quite articulate even to himself. In interviews during the tour, when journalists asked about the rumored collaboration with Lemmy that never happened, Eddie deflected, saying that scheduling conflicts had made it impossible, that maybe someday they would work together when the timing was right. But backstage, away from the cameras and the microphones, Eddie told a different story. He told his road crew that he had called Lemmy personally after the rejection, trying to understand why, trying to explain that the synthesizers were just an evolution, not a betrayal, that he was still the same guitarist who cared about the music above everything else. Lemmy had listened patiently, letting Eddie talk himself out. He and then responded with a question that cut through all the justifications and excuses like a knife through warm butter. Would Hendrix have used a synthesizer? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before Eddie quietly said he had to go and hung up the phone. That question haunted him for years afterward, echoing in his head every time he sat down at the keyboard to play Jump or any of the other songs that had made Van Halen into superstars, but had also moved them further and further away from the raw guitar power that had defined them in the beginning. Motorhead's career didn't suffer from Lemmy's decision. If anything, it reinforced their reputation as the band that would never sell out. But there was a cost, paid in smaller venues and constant struggle. While Eddie played Madison Square Garden to 20,000 fans, Lemmy played clubs in northern England to a few hundred diehards. The financial gap grew wider each year, and there were nights when Lemmy, alone in another cheap hotel room with another bottle of Jack Daniels, wondered if his principles were worth the price. But those moments never lasted long, because Lemmy couldn't be anyone other than who he was, couldn't play music he didn't believe in, couldn't pretend that everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. That authenticity, that stubborn refusal to compromise even when it hurt, was what made Motorhead matter to their fans in a way that transcended record sales. They weren't the biggest band in the world, but they were real. And that reality was worth more to Lemmy than all the stadiums and synthesizers and mainstream success that money could buy. Eddie Van Halen never forgot that phone call, never stopped thinking about the question Lemmy had asked him, and in the years that followed, the relationship between synthesizers and Van Halen became increasingly complicated and fraught. By the late 80s, Eddie had largely moved away from the keyboards, returning to the guitar-driven sound that had made the band famous in the first place, and in interviews he often spoke about the importance of staying true to your roots, of not letting commercial pressure dictate your artistic choices. Some people saw this as a direct response to Lemmy's rejection, a course correction driven by guilt or regret, or a desire to prove that he hadn't lost his way completely. And others saw it as a natural evolution, the pendulum swinging back after the experimentation of the mid-'80s. But those who knew Eddie well, who had been there during the dark nights when he wrestled with questions of identity and purpose, knew that Lemmy's words had planted a seed that never stopped growing, a constant reminder that success without integrity was just another form of failure. In 1991, 7 years after the rejection, Lemmy and Eddie found themselves at the same music industry party in Los Angeles, a rare convergence of schedules that brought together artists from across the rock spectrum. They hadn't spoken since that painful phone call in 1984, hadn't crossed paths at festivals or award shows, and the tension when they finally came face to face in a crowded room full of music executives and hangers-on was palpable. Eddie approached first, walking across the room with a drink in his hand and an expression that mixed hope and apprehension in equal measure. Lemmy watched him come, his face unreadable, and when Eddie extended his hand, Lemmy looked at it for a long moment before finally shaking it, the grip firm but not warm, professional but not friendly. They talked for maybe 10 minutes, exchanging pleasantries about tours and albums and the state of the industry, both of them dancing around the elephant in the room until Eddie finally broke the silence and said what he had come to say. "You were right." Those 3 words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and implication. And Lemmy nodded slowly, acknowledging the admission without gloating or rubbing it in. Eddie continued, and explaining that the synthesizer years had been necessary at the time, that he didn't regret the success they had brought, but that he understood now why Lemmy had said no, why some collaborations are impossible, because they represent fundamentally incompatible visions of what music should be. Lemmy listened without interrupting, and when Eddie finished, he simply said, "We all make our choices. You made yours, I made mine. No hard feelings." But there were hard feelings, on both sides, feelings that couldn't be erased by a handshake at a party or an admission of wrongdoing 7 years too late. They parted that night with a promise to stay in touch, to maybe work together someday when the time was right, but both of them knew it was a polite fiction, a way to end the conversation without admitting that the damage was permanent. The music world moved on, as it always does, with new bands and new trends and new controversies to obsess over, but the story of Lemmy's rejection of Van Halen became part of rock and roll folklore, a cautionary tale about the price of selling out and the value of staying true to yourself even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Younger musicians who came up in the 90s and 2000s would cite Lemmy's decision as an inspiration, proof that it was possible to have a long career without compromising, that commercial success wasn't the only measure of an artist's worth. Eddie Van Halen, in his later years, spoke more openly about the synthesizer period, acknowledging that it had been a double-edged sword. It brought Van Halen to heights they never could have reached with guitar rock alone. But it also cost them something intangible, something that couldn't be measured in record sales or sold-out arenas. In a 2012 interview, just a few years before Lemmy's death, Eddie was asked directly about the rumored collaboration that never happened. And for the first time he told the truth. "Lemmy turned us down because we had stopped being a rock band and started being a product. And he was right. I knew it then, and I know it now. That synthesizer on Jump made us rich, but it also made us something we never should have been." When Lemmy Kilmister died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, the tributes poured in from every corner of the music world, from punk rockers and metalheads, and even pop stars who recognized the influence he had wielded over multiple generations of musicians. And Eddie Van Halen was one of the first to release a statement, a heartfelt message that praised Lemmy's unwavering commitment to his principles and his refusal to compromise, even when it would have made his life easier. But the public statement was just the surface. Privately, Eddie told friends that Lemmy's death felt like the closing of a chapter, the final punctuation mark on a relationship defined by mutual respect and fundamental disagreement, by admiration from a distance and a friendship that never quite recovered from one phone call in 1984. Eddie died 5 years later, on October 6, 2020, from cancer that had been eating away at him for years, and in the obituaries and retrospectives that followed, many writers noted the parallel between his career and Lemmy's, two titans of rock and roll who took radically different paths to the same destination, who made choices that defined not just their music, but their entire lives. The question of whether Eddie's choice to embrace commercial success with Jump was the right one, or whether Lemmy's decision to reject it was more honorable, is ultimately unanswerable, because it depends on what you value, what you're willing to sacrifice, and what you believe rock and roll is supposed to be in the first place. But what is clear, looking back from the vantage point of history, is that both men were shaped by that night at the Rainbow Bar in 1981, by the conversation they had, and the handshake they shared, and the promise they made to each other about never letting the machine win. Eddie broke that promise, or at least he bent it until it was barely recognizable, and the guilt of that decision followed him for the rest of his life. Lemmy kept the promise, even when it cost him everything, and he died knowing that he had never compromised, never sold out, never played a note of music he didn't believe in with every fiber of his being. In the end, maybe that's all any artist can hope for, to look back on a career and know that you stayed true to yourself, that you made choices based on principle rather than profit, that you left behind music that meant something rather than just music that sold. Lemmy's rejection of Van Halen in 1984 wasn't about ego or stubbornness or jealousy. It was about understanding that some collaborations are impossible because they represent different philosophies of what art should be, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is say no, even when everyone else is telling you to say yes. That lesson, that understanding of what it means to be an artist in a world that constantly tries to turn art into commerce, is Lemmy's real legacy. And it's a lesson that Eddie Van Halen learned too late to change his path, but not too late to understand what he had lost.